loves. Tonight is Bedtime Stories with Mommy J, and we're going to do Chapter 2 of George Brown Class Clown Super Burp, which is by Nancy Krulik. And I forgot to mention and give all props and credit to the illustrated by Aaron Bletcha. Chapter 2. Class, this is George Brown. George, we want to welcome you to Class 401. George stood there looking at all the strange new kids while his teacher, Mrs. Kelly, introduced him. It was awful. The kids were all staring at him like he was a freak, a two-headed ape or something. For a second, George considered tucking his hands under his armpits and saying, ook, 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 like an ape. Nobody did a better ape imitation than George, but no. He was the new and improved George now. There would be no ooking at school. Who will volunteer to be George's buddy today? Mrs. Kelly asked. Right away, kids slid down their seats so Mrs. Kelly wouldn't pick them. George wasn't surprised. No one ever wanted to be the new kid's buddy. Finally, a girl with a long pigtail who was wearing a yellow and green Little League jersey raised her hand. George was glad someone had finally volunteered. He just kind of wished it hadn't been a girl. Mrs. Kelly nodded. Thank you, Juliana, she said. Then she smiled and turned to George. Why don't you sit at the empty desk in the third row? George walked to his assigned seat. He hated assigned seats. What if he didn't like the kids on either side of him? What if he became best friends with that short kid with curly hair and the mouth full of braces who was sitting in the fourth row? Or what if he got to be friends with the kid in the blue shirt in the second row? He was wearing the kind of sneakers that turn into skates when you pop the wheels out. You know about that. A kid with shoes like that had to be cool. Of course, that wasn't a problem right now. George didn't have any friends. The new kid never did. If only I could turn the page. Okay, class, take out your science notebooks, Mrs. Kelly said. Then she turned to George. Yesterday we were talking about the first moon landing. George smiled for the first time that day. The moon landing. They already studied that back at his old school. George's old fourth grade teacher, Mr. Guthrie, had made learning about science really awesome. He dressed like an astronaut and made the classroom look like NASA's Mission Control Center. Mrs. Kelly wore her glasses on a chain around her neck and had a piece of tissue tucked in her sleeve. And the only decorations on the classroom walls were a poster that said "Read" and a chart showing how all the letters of the alphabet looked in cursive. Now, who can tell me the name of the first man to step foot on the moon? Mrs. Kelly asked. Two hands shot up. One hand was George's. The other hand belonged to the kid with the cool sneakers. Mrs. Kelly pointed to George. Neil Armstrong, he told her. Yes, Mrs. Kelly said. Very good, George. Mrs. Kelly smiled, the kind of smile where her gums showed. George smiled back. Already he was being the new, improved, raise your hand George. The second man to walk on the moon was Buzz Aldrin, the kid with the cool sneakers called out. Instead of telling him what he wasn't supposed to call out without raising his hand, Mrs. Kelly said, That's right, Louie. Thank you for sharing such an interesting fact. One of the other kids in the class said, What kind of name is Buzz? George knew that Buzz was just the astronaut's nickname. He even knew that the guy's real name was Edwin. But he kept quiet. Yes, he wanted to be the new, improved, paying attention George. But no, he didn't want to show off or make the other kids think he was a brainiac geek or anything. Instead, he kept quiet and copied down everything Mrs. Kelly said or wrote on the blackboard. There sure were a lot of notes. After a while, George had written so much that he felt like his hand was going to fall off. He could almost picture his hand breaking away from his wrist and then walking across the floor like something out of the horror movie or from the Addams Family. Finally, Mrs. Kelly put down her chalk. Okay, everyone, let's get ready for gym, she told the kids. Mr. Trainer is absent today, so I'm taking over your class, and we're going to do something really fun. Again, Mrs. Kelly smiled her big gummy smile. As the kids lined up, George thought that he was ready for some fun. The short boy with curly hair and braces walked down the hall next to George. I guarantee this is not going to be fun, he said in a low voice, so you can stop smiling. Why? What's she going to make us do? George asked nervously. You'll see, the boy answered. But trust me, it's the worst. The end for today. That was the end of chapter 2. Tomorrow we will continue with chapter 3. I love you bunches. Good night, sweet loves.